Number 1. The Marianne Bachmeier case. What would you do if one day your loved one was murdered for no reason by a bastard? It's hard to imagine, right? But that's what Marianne Bachmeier, a mother in Germany, had to go through when her daughter was kidnapped. On May 5, 1980, Anna, Marianne's daughter, a 7-year-old girl, had an argument with her mother and decided to skip school. The girl then went to the home of Klaus Grabowski, a 35-year-old butcher, to play with his cats, and crimes were committed here. He held Anna captive for hours at home, sexually assaulted her, and finally strangled her with a pair of his fiancé's tights. According to the prosecutor, he then tied her up and stuffed her in a box, which he left on the bank of a canal. Grabowski's fiancée later turned him in to the police. After his arrest, Grabowski claimed that Anna had tried to blackmail him by threatening to tell her mother about the abuse. He said that the fear of going back to prison drove him to harm her. Despite his horrific crime, Grabowski attempted to get a reduced sentence in court by claiming he was mentally ill. As Marianne sat in the courtroom, watching Grabowski talk about his crimes without remorse, the thought of him escaping justice was too much to bear. In a moment of extreme anger, she stood up, pulled out her gun, and fired 8 bullets into Grabowski's back, killing him right there in the courtroom. Marianne was later sentenced to 6 years in prison for manslaughter and illegal possession of a weapon, but was released after serving 3 years. After the events of that day, many people sympathized with Marianne's actions, believing that it was the right thing to do to cold-blooded murderers without further trial. On the contrary, some people still believed that a constitutional state should not tolerate spontaneous justice. Number 2. The Aku Yadav case. What happens when the legal system turns a blind eye to criminals who harm people for more than a decade? That's what happened in a slum in India. Aku Yadav was a notorious gangster in Nagpur who terrorized the residents of the Kasturba Nagar slum for over a decade. During his criminal reign, Yadav murdered at least 3 people, tortured and kidnapped many, broke into homes, and raped more than 40 women and girls. Despite being arrested several times, he always managed to bribe the police with money to continue his crimes, leaving his victims powerless and living in constant fear. The turning point only came when Usha Narayani, one of Yadav's many victims, finally decided to take a stand. Usha filed a formal complaint against Yadav. When he found out, Yadav and 40 of his henchmen surrounded her house. He brought a bottle of acid, threatening to harm her if she didn't withdraw her complaint. Usha refused to back down, barricaded her door, and called the police. Of course, the police never came. Knowing no help was coming, Usha turned on the gas and lit a match, threatening to blow up the house if Yadav tried to break in. Faced with her determination, Yadav temporarily backed off. That match didn't light the gas, but it did ignite a public revolt. The residents, armed with rocks and sticks, began attacking Yadav's henchmen whenever they saw them. Eventually, the Heckmen fled the slum. In August 2004, after another arrest, Yadav was brought to court. The women of the slum, who had endured years of terror under his rule, saw this as their final chance for justice. In a moment of collective rage, around 200 women stormed the courtroom with stones, knives, and chili powder. They dragged Yadav out and beat him to death, ensuring he could never hurt anyone again. This act was not only for revenge, but also a cry of despair against a corrupt system that allowed a criminal to torment people for so long. Number 3. The case of Ken McElroy. Ken McElroy, the notorious bully of Skidmore, Missouri, terrorized the small town for years. Known for his violent behavior, McElroy was involved in burglaries, child molestation, rapes, assaults, and even attempted murders. Despite more than 20 criminal charges, he repeatedly threatened victims, bribed witnesses, or exploited legal loopholes to escape conviction. The turning point came when he attempted murder, but only seriously injured a local farmer. Once again, he was released on bail pending appeal, despite overwhelming evidence. The townspeople were uneasy. They had seen McElroy escape punishment multiple times while everyone else suffered. On the morning of July 10th, 1981, the townspeople gathered to discuss a way to protect themselves. Meanwhile, McElroy was drinking at the town bar. The news quickly reached the townspeople, and they decided to crowd the bar. After McElroy finished drinking, he bought a six-pack of beer, left the bar, and got into his pickup truck. He sat smugly in the truck with his wife. But luck was no longer with him. The anger and frustration of the townspeople reached its peak. In broad daylight, while McElroy was sitting with his wife, a group of more than 30 people surrounded the truck. They fired at McElroy, and he died right in his car. Of course, everyone in the town was happy that the thorn in their eyes had been removed. Perhaps the next thing they needed to do was remove the government that had failed to protect them in the past. Number 4. The case of Gary Plauché. On March 16, 1984, Gary Plauché shot and killed Jeff Ducey, the man who had kidnapped and sexually abused his 11-year-old son, Jody. The killing took place at Baton Rouge Airport, in front of news cameras, as Ducey was being escorted by police after his arrest. Ducey had abducted Jody from Louisiana and taken him to California, where the abuse occurred. Although Ducey had been captured, Plauché feared that the legal system might not deliver the justice his son deserved. Overwhelmed by the trauma and rage of what had happened to his child, Plauché felt compelled to take matters into his own hands. He decided to kill Ducey. Plauché waited at the airport, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. As Ducey walked by, Plauché shot him in the head at point-blank range. The scene, captured on camera, shocked the nation, but many sympathized with Plauché. They saw his actions as the desperate response of a father who believed justice could only be served by his own hand. Following the incident, Plauché was sentenced to a 7-year suspended sentence, 5 years probation, and 300 hours of community service, without serving jail time. The case gained widespread attention as some questioned whether Plauché should have been charged with murder. When asked why he shot Ducey, Plauché maintained that he had the right to kill Ducey for what he had done to his son and insisted that any parent in his situation would have done the same. Number 5. The Ellie Nesler case. The Ellie Nesler case is another classic example of a mother taking it upon herself to seek justice for her child after witnessing the evil perpetrator not being properly punished. In 1993, Ellie Nesler shot and killed Daniel Driver in a Jamestown, California courthouse. Driver was convicted of molesting Nesler's 7-year-old son, William, and like many others, anger and thoughts of revenge were inevitable, but they could have been satisfied if Driver had been convicted of a serious crime. Although Driver had a history of child molestation, he had avoided significant punishment due to legal procedures and a light sentence. Nesler, overwhelmed by the trauma her son had endured and angry at the thought that Driver might get away with a light sentence again, took matters into her own hands. Once and for all, she brought a gun to the courthouse and shot Driver 5 times in the head. Driver died instantly, ensuring that he would never harm another child again. This act of self-defense was seen by many as a desperate cry against a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable. The courthouse, a place for justice, became the setting for one mother's final act of revenge. Ellie's actions highlighted the anger and helplessness felt by victims and their families when justice seemed out of reach. That is all I have for this video. Thanks, and see you in the next times.